gentlemen.
Good evening.
I am Mrs. Robert E. Lee. The General wants to send his appreciation for you having me here to talk a little bit about our home, which is in Arlington, Virginia. Have any of you visited my home? In your century, it is a tribute to the fallen soldiers for this country. In my century, it was my home. It had been in my family for quite a few years. You may not know, but my great-grandmother is Martha Custis Washington, George Washington's wife. My father has fond memories of his adopted grandfather. He was a small boy and would go to Mount Vernon and had very vivid recollections of the people that would stop by to see him. His father inherited, when George passed away, inherited all of the memorabilia. That was then passed to my father, along with the land in Arlington Heights that my home is built on. And I wasn't born in that home, but I was taken to that home as a tiny babe. And I grew up there with servants and slaves. It was there that I met the General before we were married. And we courted on the grounds and the property there. And my father had such a great affection for George Washington that every 4th of July, he would set up George Washington's tent from the battlefield. It was a great red tent. And he would open the grounds and would ferry people across the Potomac to come and celebrate Independence Day. And people sometimes would be there for maybe a week. The celebrations would go on for a very long time. You could see Washington, the city itself. From my front porch, you could watch the city of Washington beginning to turn into the federal city that you know in your century. I was also able to watch them start to build a monument to George Washington. It did have to stop at some point, but eventually that monument was completed. Robert is actually a distant cousin of mine. This is a genealogy society, and I think you would actually enjoy looking at my genealogy. You'll find very famous American names in my family. Randolph, Washington, Lee. One of the first Lees here, you might know the name, is Light Horse Harry Lee. And he is related to my husband and myself distantly down the line. Robert, as you know, was a career military man. Robert went to West Point. Robert had a good career up until the time of the war. And it took a long time for Robert to attain the rank of general. You must remember that my husband was in service for quite some years, 20 years before he achieved that rank. But I would like to talk to you even a little more about the place that I lived. We always had time for family and friends. The house was always full of life and full of people. And on the holidays especially, our house would be full, lit with candles, holly decorating all the windows, children all around, and we would decorate a Christmas tree. Father inherited a gift that was given to the president at the time. It was a very large punch bowl. And at the bottom of that punch bowl was a masting ship. People stayed an awful long time to celebrate in the 19th century. But Papa made a rule that once you could see the bottom of the ship, at the bottom of the bowl, it was time for the company to leave. Now this bowl was so big that there were times where it took 2 or 3 days of drinking punch and making merry before the last guest would leave. I loved my home. Robert and I were married on June the 30th, and I want you to know that I did live a privileged life. We had slaves. Robert and I felt very strongly, however, and believed in the colonization program. We believed that slavery should end. But we did not share the same belief as the abolitionists did in the North, and the way that slavery should be ended. We did not agree with that. Our slaves were happy. We were a close-knit family. Robert, of course, being a career military man, we were stationed far away from my beloved Arlington. And I must confess, and Robert knew this, I was not a very good housekeeper. I had been used to my whole life having things done for me. My dear mother did educate me in the arts of sewing. She educated me in the arts of how to make guests feel welcome, how to decorate the home. And I also was an educated woman in my day. I was widely read. I read very much. I read newspapers daily, whatever papers I could get my hands on. So I was quite knowledgeable about the politics that were going on in the country at the time. Well, when Robert took me out to the fort, we had to settle in to a one-room, I guess you could call it a home. We shared it with another officer in the Army, and his wife and his 2 children. But it wasn't long after that that our first child was born. And Robert and I together had 7 children. And I've always thanked the good Lord. My children, all 7 of them, grew up to see adulthood. There were other very famous couples in your time period, such as the Lincolns and also the Davises. And they knew great tragedy with their children. They lost quite a few children, and that's a heartbreak. And Robert and I always considered that a blessing from the Lord. Robert was a very good husband and a very handsome man. I remember the day I first saw Robert come to Arlington after he had been accepted at West Point. And the horse rode up in front of the portico, and Robert was in his white pants and his blue uniform, and he looked magnificent. Robert and I always exchanged letters. We had a very, very good relationship. As time went by, we lived from place to place. Robert would write me and sometimes scold me about my housekeeping, and he would also scold me about how much money I spent. But Mama, always to the rescue, she would always feel it was the proper thing that I would live as I was accustomed to. And Robert accepted that. Eventually, we came back to stay in Arlington, and things were not looking very well in the country. Washington was full of fire, political fire. The worst, no one, I think, anticipated what was to come. Robert eventually became faced with making a decision that I believe in your time period, people still write books about. When Mr. Lincoln was elected president, southern states began to secede. Virginia, the great state of Virginia, was one of the last to do that. On April the 4th of 1861, the Virginia Assembly had voted not to secede. And it almost seemed to me like events took a life of their own. On April the 8th, Mr. Lincoln gave orders that Fort Sumter should be resupplied by the Navy. Fort Sumter is off the coast of South Carolina. The South Carolinians decided to fire on that fort. A few days after that happened, Mr. Lincoln called for 75,000 volunteers. Mr. Davis, who had already been elected president, he called for 100,000 men to volunteer for the Southern cause. Robert was asked to come and see General Scott in Washington. General Scott wanted to give my husband a generalship, and he would remain in charge of the volunteer army that was being created in the federal states. My husband came home with this information. He was greatly troubled. He had always been loyal to the Union. For that whole day, I could remember Robert, distant, worried. We had had many people stop by Arlington, concerned about what was happening with the firing on Fort Sumter, what was going to happen next. Rumors were everywhere. We had heard that the Confederates were going to come and storm Washington, that they were right on the border. The governor of Pennsylvania had sent out a call so that his troops would arrive in Washington to help protect the Capitol. And Robert had paced all day long, well into the night. At one point, he excused himself from his company, and he retired upstairs. I remained downstairs. I entertained the last of the company until well after midnight. Finally, Robert came down and told me he had made his decision, an agonizing decision for both of us. But Robert felt that his loyalty was to Virginia. That decision changed my life. Not only the country's life, but my life and my Arlington. I had been convinced that I was going to be able to stay at Arlington, that those fools in Washington and the politicians would eventually come to their senses and resolve these issues. However, that did not happen. Robert had already taken his commission as a general from President Davis. He was in Richmond. He would write to me all that month, urging me to please leave Arlington. The newspaper stepped in. There were articles in the newspaper that very much disturbed me. They were accusing my husband of being a traitor. They were saying that Arlington had 30,000 troops, Confederate troops, poised to attack the Capitol. As I sat and read this paper on my front porch and looked out over my land, there was no one there but myself, a few of my children, and the servants. Where were these 30,000 Confederates? I took it upon myself to write a letter to that newspaper, and I took exception that they would accuse Robert or anyone living in Arlington as being a pack of traitors. Needless to say, it continued on. And what really bothered me is Arlington did not belong to Robert E. Lee. Arlington belonged to Mary Lee. The papers whipped up cry to frenzy. Yet still I was able to travel back and forth and go into the city of Washington for what I needed. And I happened to run into a cousin who was in a parade that day. And I began to notice there was a difference between what was being said in the paper and how supportive everyone was of this, that the Union would rise up and really stomp on the Southerners. And there was no cheers, not even little kids. The soldiers just marched. My cousin recognized my carriage, and he had come up to me, and I said, "What is this all about? Why are you marching?" He had informed me that they had word that yet again there were more troops poised at Arlington to attack the city. I told my dear cousin there was no one there but myself. Needless to say, it went on till finally by the middle of May, and at Robert's urging, I had to get out of Arlington. There were 10,000 federal men coming across the Potomac to take possession of my land and my home. Well, I got the silver, I got the china, I got the punch bowl, packed up, crated, and I sent that on to Robert in Richmond, where I knew that would be safe. I had Grandmother Martha's draperies taken down from the windows and hidden in the attic. I had the personal papers of my great-grandfather and I had the Lee papers and the Custis papers all packed up and sent out of the house. It was a very eerie day, the day that I left, and I was able to go stay with friends who had a plantation not too far from Arlington. But my heart always stayed at Arlington. We had no word of what was going on there, with the exception that the 10,000 Yankees were on my property. Now, the general in charge there was a guy by the name of McDonald. General McDonald did post orders that there was to be no disturbance in my home, that they were to leave my servants alone, they were not to take anything from my garden. It lasted roughly 3 weeks, and then they began to relax that, and eventually my gardens were trampled. How I came to hear this is one of my servants came riding to where I was because they had beaten his wife and had killed their dog, the Yankee soldiers. I whipped up the nastiest note I could and let them know that I would not stand for the treatment of my servants, nor would I allow them to tear apart my home. Well, needless to say, I had asked to go out and see my home, and I was denied access to my own home. They would not allow me there. Eventually, we were able to get relatives in there to take out what remained, and the reports that came back to me broke my heart and put me in tears. They had dismantled the fences. The beautiful, beautiful living oak trees that were in my plantation were gone. They had cut them down. They had taken the fireplaces apart to burn. They were encamped right on my front porch. Well, Robert was aware of this. There was nothing much we could do. The war was on. However, it was interesting to find I did receive a bill to pay taxes to the United States government. And not only did I have to pay those taxes so I would not lose Arlington, but I had to appear in person to pay those taxes. Robert felt that there was something more to that story than just me appearing to pay taxes. And he felt it was unconstitutional under the United States Constitution, so we sent a relative in with the money to pay the taxes. They refused. They refused, and they confiscated my home, my lands, because I could not come in person to pay those taxes. And everything that was left at Arlington, especially of my great-grandfathers, they also confiscated, transported it back over the Potomac. And I have to tell you, even after the war ended, and I sued the government to get my property back, and I won, I never got it. It remains still to this day in federal museums in Washington, D.C. As the war dragged on, many on both sides lost their lives. The Washington hospitals were full to the brim. Soldiers were dying. Even the cemeteries, there was no room left. By that point, they had put a general by the name of Meachus in charge of Arlington Heights. You might know this man today. He's the man who is responsible for having the Capitol Dome put on in Washington, D.C. He was no friend even after the war. He had a very hard stand against Southerners who rebelled, especially my husband. He had gone to Secretary Stanton with an idea that those soldiers that were couldn't be buried someplace in Washington, that Arlington would become a national cemetery for those soldiers who had fallen. They did, however, allow that the rebel soldiers could also be buried there. However, his directive did not sit well with some of the other officers. Although they obeyed their order, they were burying the bodies far away from my home. General Meachus didn't like that. He tried to correct it once. He reissued the order. Again, they buried in another corner of my property, but it was not near the house. Lee just became so enraged that he actually went out and he walked the line and marked the graves right in my garden, so that when you would step off my portico, my front portico, you would actually be stepping right into soldiers' graves. Well, there was nothing Robert and I could do. We did fight that after the war, but as it is a tremendous, tremendous compliment to all soldiers who have passed, and the general and myself are very proud of that. But at the time, it was a very bitter pill for Robert and I to follow. I would encourage you, if you visit the National Cemetery, to please come to my home and see the grandeur of that home. Robert and I always felt, even after the war, that we loved our country. We were not in favor of disunion, but rather that the Union could be preserved. But as you all know, in your century, that just was not to be. The General would like me to extend that invitation to you as well as myself. And thank you for your time.
If there are any questions, I'd be more than glad to answer. Where is General Lee Robert buried?
Actually, both he and Mrs. Lee are buried in Virginia. Oh, the name of the town escapes me.
It's not Arlington.
No, he's not in Arlington. Oh, it's Arlington, Arlington. VMI is there, Virginia Military Institute. Because after the war, the general actually was able to get a position teaching at this college in the country. And they bought a home there, and they actually settled there. The Lees did, after the war, she did in fact take a suit against the federal government for the confiscation of her property. Not only the lands, but she had, George Washington's and Martha's China as first president of the United States. That was confiscated. There were some very famous portraits. I believe one of them is by Peel, that the government never gave back, even though they won the suit. And as you know, Lee didn't live very long after the war. He had passed away in his position, as a teacher. He was up in age. Even then, I think some of the guys in here studying the military history, at the beginning of his career with the Civil War, at that point, they were referring to him as old Rand. He was gray, gray whiskers. They felt he didn't have what it took, to get the job done, but he did. Mrs. Lee, when you look at the Lee family, when you look at them, they were quite different from what you might be reading about the Lincolns and even the Davises. They had a very harmonious marriage, very harmonious. Lee was away most of the time because he was a military man, but she followed him. There were times where Lee felt it may be too rough, especially because the kids were really 2-3 years apart. They were kind of close together. And for a woman, who was tended to by slaves, she was an excellent mother. A little on the permissive side, but they both were. They both were. He, because, he's away, he comes home, he's spoiling the kids rotten. And she was just this effervescent, bubbly woman who was, Chester, you asked me about the king. Mrs. Lee was crippled with rheumatoid arthritis. She was a very active woman when she was young. Her garden was something, according to everything I've ever read, was something to see. And she did it all herself, of course with the help of servants and slaves, but it's absolutely beautiful. And she would rather be outside the house than inside the house. So she took great care and loved it dearly. They said, their reports and other letters of people who had visited Arlington, that the air, just breathing the air, was so perfumed, just from the type of flowers and shrubbery that she had, in her garden. She had had a couple of bouts and a couple of close calls with death herself. She managed to come back. I believe they were, I think in our day, she probably had pneumonia a couple times, but beat it. Some infections, especially after childbirth, but she beat it. The arthritis did cripple her, and eventually she was walking with a cane. By the end of her life, she was in a wheelchair.
How old was she when she died?
She was 70. She was 70. They were not a young couple when the war broke out. As a matter of fact, let's see. Son Robert served, I think 3 of the sons served in the Confederate Army. They all survived the war. They all survived the war. The worst that happened, I think she had a daughter who, it was one of those situations where somebody thinks the other one is watching, got a pair of scissors and actually gouged her eye. So the one daughter, I believe it was Agnes, was blinded in that eye. I got one from So they, you know, they knew some hardship, but not nearly what the Lincolns did, the Davises did.
Did any of her letters survive to the tomb?
Yeah. As a matter of fact, she hid them well. She hid them well. They did survive, and I believe they called her Precious. She's the youngest child of the 7, and that was her name, Precious. Precious kept all of this. So there's a very good biography out on her now, which is called Mrs. Robert E. Lee. And she uses a lot of the personal letters. She was also, right before they got married, she's an interesting woman because when she had a conversion, she had a dear aunt that died. And she was sort of on the fence about religion and what she believed or whether or not she was saved. Not uncommon in the time, because they did believe that you needed to have a physical conversion. Well, she had had hers right before she married Robert. Most of their married life, we read a lot of letters. She was on Robert about his experience. She was never quite sure whether Robert, had been so converted to the Lord as she was. And if you read her letters, they are quite moving because she really does, as much as what's going on and all the hardship that they dealt with, Mary pretty much would say, Lord, thy will be done. And she was very content. And she was very happy. Rarely do you see her complain. She would get fiery mad about stuff that she would read in the paper, especially about Robert. And she took great exception to the fact that the newspapers in the North were referring to Arlington as General Lee's property. It was her property. She took exception to that.
That's what I wanted to ask you. So most of Arlington Lee land?
All of it. It was a plantation. It was huge. And that was all her property. Lee had properties of his own. There were other properties that they owned. Part of what General Lee had a problem with before the war broke out is when Mary's father died, George Washington Park, Custis, when he passed away, he was a very happy-go-lucky guy, but he didn't really have a mind for business, and he left the estate a mess. So Robert had to actually request leave from the military so that he could come back to Arlington and straighten the whole mess out. There was a home called Ravensworth, which I believe would have been on Martha Washington's sister. That property eventually came to Mary. And there was another one, I believe they called the White House, which would have been the grandmother's home, her grandmother on the Custis side of the family. So they huge tracts of land, in that upper Virginia Peninsula. But the guy partied. I don't know how else to put it. Her father just loved people. He was very dedicated to George Washington's memory. There are some great speeches. You can even Google that and get some great speeches about Washington that her father actually wrote. So he was the keeper. He was the keeper of the flame. And after he passed away, Mary had often said that she was glad that he had passed, that she wouldn't come to, he would see, what was happening, to all his property, what was happening to the country. He was very concerned, about that. Because as far back, the 1840s, they avoided the Civil War for about 20 years. They put that war off for about 20 years. They tried. So the papers were always loaded with, when they had the Missouri Compromise, the distillers that we had. As early as 1859, John Brown's attack, and that was all connected back to the North with the abolitionists. And there were extremes on both sides. And the newspapers of the day fanned a lot of that, depending which part. Well, it's funny. The more things change, the more things stay the same. You can go back. The irony, that I found in this too is that, there they are, and the Union occupies, that land, and yet the slaves still were there. Slaves were working for the Union Army, in 1861. So it's kind of a little bit of an irony there. It's not like they said, you're free. No, that wouldn't happen until 1863. So it's still the law of the land, even then.
All those soldiers that were buried on the estate, were they eventually moved to the National Cemetery, or?
That is the National Cemetery.
It is, the estate is the National Cemetery, I didn't know that.
That's how they took it from the family, so it would never go back into the family's name. They turned it to a national cemetery. The other ones that fought for the South received their land back, but as soon as the government turned that over to the national cemetery and it became national property, they could never get their property back.
They fought it, but Meegis, too, one of the things, too, about him, he was with Lee. He knew Lee when they were back, in their younger days. They served together, and Meegis could not forgive Lee.
How do you spell that name?
M-E-G-I-S. He was very anti-Southern. Even after Lincoln was assassinated, they did have a tough time with that. There were still those who believed that the South should have been punished and punished severely. Meegis was kind of aligned himself with that group, even then. Now they can't prove it, but they actually believe that this idea of his to turn Arlington, into the cemetery for the fallen soldiers was really motivated by his own personal feelings, and it was a vindictive move. But nobody, if there's something out there that he wrote, that has not surfaced. So it's just kind of like things are mentioned, via letters to other people. That's kind of how it got a life of its own. But he did, this was his idea. And he was an architect, I believe. And thereby he was the one who worked on the Capitol building. That's another irony. It was wood. They were going to the steel structure. And who worked on it? The slaves. So, there's a lot of ironies there. But yet he just did not care for what Lee did. And for the rest of his life, from what I've read, he just could not get past that. With Robert E. Lee.
Is that cemetery filled now or still burning?
I don't know. I really don't know if it is or not. One of the things that was very upsetting, though, which I did not realize either, and I've never been up that close, when he did start to put in the soldiers' bodies, they did bury rebels there. But there was a British fellow who had been visiting the country right at the end of the war, and he went there. And in his letter, he writes that, the Union soldiers, they had their name, company, dating that. The Confederate soldier, all it said was rebel. No name, And there is I don't recall, I have to look it up, but also close to the house, I believe in the front, there's a mass grave of soldiers who died at Manassas, from Bull Run.
Are there still supposed to have rebel ones?
Yeah.
To this day?
Yeah.
Oh my God.
I was wondering, you referenced a book that had a lot of letters in it. Is that where you got most of your information, was her personal letters that were in the book?
Yeah, the letters, I think the letters really give you the flavor of what she was like. She was also, before the war broke out, and I think you can still get it in print, it's called Recollections and Memoirs of George Washington. Her father had started it The father started to write this book about George Washington. He never quite got to finish it. She resurrected this project, and she actually finished it and took it to the publishers and was responsible for getting it out there. And it was quite popular, quite a popular book. You know, she gave the credit, you know, to her father, but it was a quite popular book about Washington. And I really think that's a book, if you study that era, the Revolutionary and that generation, that's a book well worth looking into.
Wasn't there a leading sign the Declaration of Independence?
Yeah. Yeah.
I can't remember which one of them.
See, you know, I think again, that's something that we kind of have to look back and think on because, you know, 6 or 7 years before, all these people were on the same page. And the issue of slavery had come up then. Jefferson brought it up. There's a difference of opinion with regard to, well, why it was, you know, let out of the, you know, when they were developing the Declaration, you know, there's different schools of thought on that. But that was an issue. There were many who felt at the time that in order for slavery to go, that it would have to take a natural course, and many people felt that it would actually come from religion. In other words, the only thing to end it was going to be religious conscience. Okay, that just a moral, it's not right to enslave a fellow man. And a lot of people begged on that, but it just never got to that point. The abolitionists up north, they wanted it, and they wanted it now, and that just snowballed.
But Jefferson said that it's like blowing the wolf by the ears. You don't like it, but you don't dare let it go.
No, and Jefferson, there's argument about this, which is the schools of thought. Jefferson, he had an extensive slave population. And in some of his writings, you can see where he really does feel he has the wolf by the ears. Because there was a problem. There was an issue with regard to, okay, you have a million man, woman, and child population in the South under slavery, okay? You let them free. Where do they go? Where do
They
they
didn't
go?
know what to do.
No, they really didn't know what to do. They really didn't know what to do. It was, well, they referred to it as a peculiar institution. But gradually, you can see the states, you know, gradually began to, you know, the North did it first. England actually they actually set it off in England. They abolished it, they abolished the trade. It didn't affect the United States, in my opinion, because at that point they had taken in quite a few, thousands upon thousands, who are now starting to have the second generation. So they enslaved the second generation, which would produce a third generation. So they were repopulating in this country. You didn't need to go to Africa or the islands, you know, to do that. And even with the issue of slavery, when you look at it, in 1863, Lincoln freed the slaves in the states that seceded.
Yeah.
There was a select number of states. Maryland was not one of them.
Yeah.
Maryland, in its own right, I think it took them a year, by 1864, they had passed laws, you know, to free the slaves. So the border states, for those sitting on the fence, Lincoln, you know, it was a difficult time for him in making some of these decisions.
Now, when were the slaves given the right to vote? Because didn't they consider them like only 3/5 of a person for
The Constitution, yeah, that was part of the, early on that was.
But when did they actually get the
Well,
vote?
you know, the war was supposed to settle that, and I think, wasn't Johnson, I think it was Johnson, even with Johnson. And that was one of the things that was very disappointing, because with Reconstruction, they could have done that a lot sooner. The Democrats in the South, again, this is just somebody else's theory, there's a couple of them out there. This one I happen to think is a pretty good one. But the Democrats started to come back one by one. They were given self-government in the United States that seceded, and they found ways around Jim Crow laws. Okay, and that's what that came out of. So, you know, Lincoln's assassination, I think Johnson tried to carry out Lincoln's philosophy because, you know, what was it? Malice towards none. But once he was removed, Johnson was a Southerner, and the politics is complicated.
I think the lucky winner of this raffle tonight is going to learn a lot more about Civil War. But you were wonderful. Yeah. I really appreciate it. Anybody want any more tickets before I ask this lovely lady to pick the winner?
Just for your information, this celebration this weekend of Memorial Day, that was the ladies of the South who began that tradition. When the war was over, and of course, great loss on both sides, the ladies in the South, in May, it was their tradition to take flowers and garlands. They would go to their loved ones' stones and they would decorate them with the flowers in remembrance. Hence, Decoration Day. A lot of this room would remember it was always called Decoration Day. That's where the term comes from. It's actually from the South.
We have some people, some of the variants kind of crazy. That's big.
Esther.
Yes.
That's the custom sleeve.
I have to get some more tickets. You'll have to excuse me a minute.
Don't let her buy any.
No, they're in,
I'm gonna win it, that's right.
Yeah, right.
Right?
No, I am.
God, I can tell you how to get there. I can see the building in my mind. But they're still there. The flags, the tent. There's a lot of things that eventually, I mean, this woman, as crippled as she was, my dad made this stuff up. And she was creating this stuff around some of it. I don't think they ever recovered. No, actually they did. Martha Washington's drapes. There is a cousin by the name of Britannia, I can't think of her last name. She actually got permission to go into the house while it was under, federal army, and she took the drapes. But I don't know what happened to Martha's drapes. Apparently they were nice and heavy. They were something that in her letter she talks about hanging those in the winter months.
Those aren't the ones Cal Burnett wore in that show, then?
You know what, Joe? They might have been. They might have been.
That's great. Did you get up and show your outfit? Model, come. You have to come up
He
here.
knew my great-grandfather. He knew my great-grandfather.
Yeah, we served under George Washington.
We served under
At
great-grandfather.
Valley Forge, the 24th Connecticut was stationed at Valley Forge with George Washington from this area.
This has certainly made your trip worthwhile, right? I believe you. I don't have to check it. I like your that is wonderful. And thank you to Alice Grzyzbowski and Olivia Tizzoni. They do this every month, and we really appreciate it. We enjoyed your talk. Thank you very much.
Some of the clothing that they would have worn in the 18th century, their shirts were baggy. This is linen, cotton. This is waistcoat. They would always carry a knife, whether it be on the belt or on the top. This is your haversack. Your haversack is where you carry your food, your different supplies. A lot of times you'd have a cup off it. You'd have your spoon and fork in here, a bowl in here that you would eat with. They call these are trousers. The trousers are cotton. Bottom of your trousers, they call these gaiters. The gaiters would protect your socks when you were walking through the woods so nothing would cut your socks up. You have your leather shoes. Leather shoes would have your flat toes. A lot of the today's sayings come from back there. You know how they say don't be a square? Don't be a square come from your shoes. In the 17th century, they wore square buckles. In the 18th century, they went to round ones. So you had round buckles on your shoes. They would say, don't be square, because they went to the round buckles. Lock, stock, and barrel. That was your flintlocks. Your lock was the hammer mechanism. Your stock was the wood, and the barrel was the gun. So a lot of the old sayings come from back then. When you'd have a waistcoat, it was improper to go out without a hat. You always had a hat. They had a workman's cap. If you took a big hat off like this, they would have a workman's cap. If you looked, they had, the one side of the hat was always bent up. The reason the hat was bent up on the one side was because of your musket. Everyone carry their musket in their left hand. The musket went over the shoulder. That left room for the musket to go by the hat. They call them a cock hat. They had the tricons. If they were in the military, they were cocked. They would turn it so that side, the musket would go by your hat. If you were in the military, you would have, everything went on in place. This would be the last thing to go. So your haversack went on first. The next thing would be your bayonet and your sword, because that would be another thing that you would lose. Then your next one would be your cartridge box. And then your last that you put on would be your canteen, because you would always be using your canteen to drink. You'd be carrying your gun. If you're going to get rid of stuff, you'd take your canteen off and let it sit. You would get rid of your cartridge box, your gun, your bayonet, your sword, but you would always have your haversack, which is your food and your utilities. So, but it was cotton and linen. Everything was
What's that
cotton.
tailing bed?
Pardon me?
What's that tailing bed?
This is a red fox. Red fox, a lot of times what they'd use them for, it would keep the bugs away. The bugs would go away from their face and it would be on the tail. And if they got rain on their hat, it would soak up the rain and the rain would drop off. A lot of your leathers, they called them your frocks. If you looked at a frock, they would have fringes on it. The fringes would collect the water, so the water would drop off their clothes. Like the old cowboys, you know, the cowboys would have the leather. That was to divert the water, so it would divert the water off the clothing. It would go down those strips and it would dry out faster. Your buttons on your breeches, when they had breeches, they would have buttons up the side. Reasons for the buttons being is that you would never take your shoes off. You left your shoes on because you slept in a tent. You would unhook the buttons and you would pull your breeches down over your shoes. We have tents that we go camping in. The tent would be from here to that counter, that deep, and they're about 5 feet wide. 6 men would sleep in the tent. They would sleep side by side. And why you'd have so many is the men would sleep so close and warm. That's what kept them warm. It was not an easy life. 29 days. When they left Yorktown, when Washington left Yorktown, 29 days later, they were in Boston, Massachusetts. They walked from Yorktown to Boston in 29 days. The only time during the war was when he left Yorktown, they stopped at Mount Vernon. That was the only time during the Revolutionary War that he was home. And they camped out at Mount Vernon on the way to Boston.
Martha visited him from time to time.
Yeah.
Martha went to him.
Yeah, she visited him at Valley Forge.
Yeah.
She
Did
really-
Valley Forge?
And the men really loved Washington and Martha. When Martha come to Valley Forge, a lot of the men, like I said, they had a lot of time. They would carve different things. They gave gifts to Martha because of being George Washington's wife. They really respected both of them. And if anyone gets a chance, go to Mount Vernon. They put a new museum in there, and it's unreal. It really is. And at the end of the Revolutionary War, the way the government was set up, most of the government was set up because of Washington. They said after the end of the war, he could have been king.
Yep.
I mean, you could have that kind of government because the people loved him that much. And he says, no, I don't want to rule the country. I want it ruled by the people. So a lot of the democracy and the rights we have today was because of him.
This is actually made from a period correct pattern. What I'm actually wearing tonight is different. Those of you saw it the last time, this would be considered a ball gown or a formal. And the reason I chose this is because, especially in the South, that society, they were dancing and they had balls and they raised money for this cause by doing that. But this actually is, the ladies were then changed from a 4-bow hoop and a 6-bow hoop underneath the skirt. They went for nice full flounce. It's the only time you will see the ladies with their shoulders and the neck open and the arms showing. It's the only time.
It's not made of bone underneath it, your hoop. What's your hoop made of?
This is bone. This is
That
bone.
really is
Yeah,
bone?
This is bone, yeah.
Oh, I thought they used modern, so they have something else.
Yeah, it's
Oh,
bone,
really? I
and
think
then
it's-
cloth over the bone.
Since I was wondering, since you were so close to Washington, being in Arlington, were you under house arrest? Or like you said, you were free to come and go. I'm surprised that you weren't like sequestered or
It was
anything by the union.
because in the 19th century, how could I explain this? You might see something like that happen today. But in those days, people were considered highly improper for you to, unless, and this rarely happens, only a few cases of women who were actually, the bellboys and war spies. But the men respected, that they didn't bring the wives and the children, into the conflict. So they would have respected it. Lee was concerned because Lee knew, his affection for the South. He did become concerned that, you can get an officer in there and maybe he doesn't have complete control of this thing. There was concern for her safety. But most women in the South were left alone. They would come in and pillage livestock, they would come in and take horses, both sides did it, but they would not harm the women and the children. They, some of the ladies were feisty. They saw more of that than we did in the North. This far north, we read about it in the papers. And there were rumor, and the furthest they came in here is to Gettysburg.
Yeah, most of Virginia, really.
And those ladies, don't kid yourself, as polite as society was, they were feisty, and even the ones, in Gettysburg, there were a couple raids before Gettysburg, the battle actually happened, and there's a story from Gettysburg where there were free blacks in the town. And the Confederate soldiers, it was a beloved family. The town loved this particular family. And they were carting her and her family off back into slavery. And it was the women who went after these Confederate soldiers. I mean, physically went after them, to leave them alone. And eventually they did. They did. And then what the town did, the town took them and got them out of there. Got them deeper into the north, because what they operated under was the fugitive, slave law.
Yeah.
They had the right to go in because that was their property. They didn't look at it as though they were human beings. This is my property. So we have even up here, when you start to look locally and you look at Scranton, if you look at the Underground Railroad, it's very interesting to see that it comes directly at us. And then it actually goes around us. That's one of the things I'm kind of looking at now, because I can't understand it. I can't really find anything to say that Scranton itself, as the city developed, was a Copperhead haven. Copperhead was anti-war. Union as it is, Democrat. I can understand it in Luzerne County because they actually ran a Judge Woodward who did very well for himself from Wilkes-Barre. They ran him against Governor Curtin, who was the war governor here at the time. And it was kind of interesting, but he was labeled in the newspapers as a Copperhead because he had views that the Union as it is, okay? And then they accused him of supporting slavery, all kinds of stuff went on. He gave speeches in Philadelphia. Curtin didn't win, but there might have been more doubt, but you can see, that's what I'm looking for, is the Copperhead from being prevented them coming right up through the city.
It seems to be like Mrs. Lee was very well read for her time.
Yeah,
Am I right?
she
Very
was.
well educated.
She was, and I think, one of the things they taught me when I was getting my master's is that when you get into history, when you get into, a different period, you have to accept their culture, their society, for the way it was. And you have to try really hard not to pass judgment. The second thing too, that at least I've discovered, not any different today. If you had money and means, even as a woman, you obtained an education. To be an educated woman was favorable. What they didn't want you to do, society dictated this, you weren't going to go out and work.
No.
Okay, you weren't going to go out and work. But you could paint, you could play music, and some women did. You know, you look at Louise Malka. She became a writer. You'll notice there's a lot of women who wrote, you know, fiction, even some nonfiction, as Mrs. Lee did. They were published and very popular. And that's where it started to be, you know, these acceptable roles, you know, for women to go out and earn money. The schools, you know, in the school system, especially during the war, you had your schoolmaster. All the teachers were male. Okay? When that fella either volunteered or he was conscripted into the army, and there were no other fellows in the town, what the school boards at the time began to look for was a woman who could read, write, and do arithmetic, the 3 R's, well. And you read, you'll see a little advertisement that said they have to do it well. And then they would come in to try and take over. But in small places, like here, generally what ended up happening is you as mom, you're not only running the farm or running the house close to town or the business because your husband is, you know, serving the cause, you know, you become, because many of the pastors served, you know, so you became the religious teacher, you became reading, writing, arithmetic, history. Those, though, that did not have the money to meet, the immigrants, the Irish in particular, in the 1840s they were coming over in droves. They were not educated, they were laborers. They weren't even skilled laborers. There is where it, you know, chances are that woman, she can maybe make the X, you know, unless she's self-taught. And that's how that parochial school system develops too. It's because they see the need. When these kids are out on the street, you know, parents are trying to work, nobody's watching the kids. So the church basically steps in and develops these schools so that these kids could learn. So,
In the Civil War, there are a lot of women that followed their husbands.
Yes, yeah.
Themselves as men.
Yes, many felt strong enough about themselves and the cause to actually fight on their own. Many went and put the uniform on so that they could be with their husband. And then there were women who followed, you know, they followed the army. And they would earn money. They were poor. So they would wash the shirts. They would mend, you know, put the buttons back on. They would do some cooking. And they would follow. And you can't break behind them. But those, again, are probably what they would consider not in Mrs. Lee's, you know, social status.
Now, is Harper Lee a descendant?
You know, I believe, I'd like to double check it to make sure, but I think she is. I think her tree is connected to the Lees.
Because if there were 7 kids, they're all.
Yeah, and I think, she actually ended up, on 7 kids, she had 10 grandchildren. Because I think 2 of the girls married, but they died young. They died in their 20s, 30s. I think it was the firstborn son, he had 7 children. And then there was another daughter she married, and she had 3. And I think that was Precious. That was the last one she had. The last one of Lee's immediate family died in 1918. Nice family. The Davises, Rita Davis.
One more question?
Sure.
You had mentioned the Custis parties where they had Washington's red tent.
Yes.
Did that survive?
I think they have it. I think they do. I don't know if you know Homer or not, but I think they still have that.
I haven't seen it. A lot of the stuff like that I thought would have shown up in Washington's museum, and I didn't see it there. There's replicas of it, I know that. I mean, it just like his casket, Washington was removed from his tomb and reburied. When they removed him, they took his casket and they redid the casket. The replica isn't lead lined, but a lot of the stuff that they told that Washington had, they redid. Now his teeth, he had wooden teeth, that's why he never smiled. His wooden teeth is on display there in the museum. And a lot of his firearms and stuff like that is on display.
Washington's original casket was lead lined?
Lead lined, yes. And when we moved him from his old burial ground to the new one, they put him in a new crypt, and he's there next to Martha. They made a replica of that casket, and that's in the museum now. And pieces of the old one is there inside of a temperature controlled, because you're talking over 200 years. I mean, and it's in pieces of it. So they knew what it looked like, and they had the material it was made out of, so they made a replica of it. But a lot of the stuff, like when we go to these events, when we did the camping at Mount Vernon, his red tent was there, the flags was there, but they were all reproductions, you know. But there's people that dress in his uniform. It's his clothing. There's a person, Henry Cook. I went to one of his classes here 3 months ago to make breeches. Henry Cook made all of the clothing for the 3 stages of his life in that museum. But they were all hand sewed, and it was all period clothing. Was on they reproduced the material, the linen to sew. The stitches are the exact amount of stitches per inch. Everything's reproduced, but the original stuff, I don't think the tent would have made it. I really don't.
I don't know, you know, I know it survived. You know, it was still within the family, but I don't know how he has it now. Because I think that one of the items she got to leave, I think I corrected that. She got that stuff to leave Richmond, and they hung on to it. But actually after, when he surrendered, you know, Richmond felt, I'm not sure. You know, I read that there's still some articles that are in the National Museum of something or other, but just, I remembered it's Leesburg. That's exactly where he's buried, in Leesburg. And Traveler's also buried with the general, his horse. Yeah, and again, it's like you're talking about, and he's incorrect. And so is Mrs. Lee. Right outside of that, and again, it's the same as you described, there are gates. And you can see, like a mausoleum, the Lee family, their gates there. You step out, you know, to the right, and as you go out the little arch, you look down to your left, and there's that huge marker for Traveler, for the horse. He loved that horse, yeah.
Did he die long after he did? Right after?
I think he died before the general, and I think it was the general's desire to have him buried there. That's it. That's the college he eventually, he couldn't find work after the war. He was so hated. The South loved him, but it was very difficult for him.
Who died first?
He did. Then she died. Marina Davis, she lived, I think she died in 1917, 1918. She lived a long time. She left the South. She was hated in the South after the war. And I think even Mrs. Lee, the women who were, you know, very well read and read newspapers, they had their reservations about the outcome of the war. Marina was outspoken. Now, she's the first lady of the South. And the grand dames of Richmond did not appreciate the fact that she was honest in her opinions to them. So she had a very difficult time assimilating into Richmond society when, you know, the Southern White House was moved into Richmond. She had a difficult time. After Jeff Davis died, she had one child that survived to adulthood. And this child, the South, basically venerated. She was, you know, she was the daughter of the South, and that's exactly what they referred to her as. And there were a lot of demands on Mrs. Davis and the daughter to live up to that Southern philosophy. You know, he never really kind of accepted the fact that they had lost a way of life. And they lived that vicariously through the people who had survived. That they had lost. Verena was, she was from the South. But she again was exposed to, because her father had had some money. He lost it. He didn't do well business either. But she was educated in Washington and Philadelphia. She went to school in the North. So she went to a girls' school in Philadelphia. She had many friends in the North and some family living in the North at the time of the war. And after the war, the ladies, and that society in the South really never forgave her. They wanted her to come and continue to talk about Jeff Davis. She was really getting up there in age. She had the one daughter left. This is really a sad story. She hadn't married. She met a fella who owned a factory. Now, this is 1870s, late 1870s, maybe early 1880s. She's pushing 30, okay, which was spinsterhood in those days. She meets this fella. Apparently they fall in love. Her father was still alive. He really gave her a hard time in accepting this marriage because she was marrying an ordinary. Finally, Jeff Davis, he consents to this. In the meantime, before the wedding takes place, Jeff Davis passes away. You know, Southern society would not accept him, gave them such a hard time that the daughter breaks the engagement. Yeah. The fellow never married. Never married. She never married. A couple years after this, Memorial Day, the Memorial Day celebration, Verena's just too old to go, so the daughter goes in her place. They pick her up from the train station in Richmond in an open carriage, and it's pouring rain. Pouring rain. She's soaked to the bone. She gives her speech. She gets out on the train, goes back to New York, and she gets pneumonia. She's dead within 30 days, at the age of 32. So Verena, she gave a lot. She really did. I would recommend anybody to read a biography on Verena. She is a very strong, independent-minded woman who really kind of had to pay for that, you know, in her society. She was younger than him. And I think she died, he died in 1870, and I think she died in 1873. So they were close together. She also had a child. One of her children also died the second year, as she did. But of all those families, they really were, you know, there was no dysfunctionality, to use our term, you know, in that family. It was really, really nice.
A lot of the women back then were actually really powerful. They had more power than what women did later on, because here their husbands would be gone for 4 to 5 months. They're running a plantation, telling 500 slaves what to do, what to order, what to sell, where the crops are going. They ran the whole plantation. So I mean, later on, when communication and travel became easier, the women actually had less and the husband took over more responsibility. But back in this time, when the husband was gone for 2 or 3 months, the one that run the plantation was the woman. She had to know how to read, write, order things. She was the boss of that plantation.
They had a plantation. They were selling tobacco, they were selling cotton. You know, and Lee's a clear, you know, he marries into this family. He marries into a property family.
Joanne, may I interrupt you for a second?
Sure.
There might be some people who have other engagements or other reasons for leaving. Let's invite them to leave, but if they want to invite them to stay, we can stay, and as long as they want to stay, we'll stay, but let's not keep anyone who may want to. So anyone's free to leave, and those who are free to stay, please stay.
But she, you know, that was not his property. His family had that property, his direct line of Lee's. Some bad decision making, so he did not have nearly as much in property wealth as she did. And there were other Lee boys, and that's one of the reasons, you know, Robert was not the eldest in that family, which was very common in those days. The eldest was going to get the most out of the man. What was Robert going to do? He went into the service. And it was the lead name that actually got him the appointment to West Point. He did okay there. He did okay there, but he was not at the top of his class. But he had to come, he only stepped in, I think, to help straighten it out, because Verena, with the death of her father, she was overwhelmed. She was because they were very close. They were very, very close, her father and she. And I think, her mom survived her father. A few years later, she lost her mom. Lots of family, and after the celebrations were just unbelievable. Christmas at Arlington, they actually talk about, Lee is writing a letter to a friend of his, and I think this actually happened to be at their wedding. And he's writing about making arrangements because he has to report back to duty. And he's writing they got married on the 30th. It's already like July 7th or something. And the men have left. However, he puts in, the women are staying an extra week. Okay, and you're talking 20 women. You're not talking, a handful of women decide to stay over. They stayed. They traveled, so they stayed. And they entertained. And you would have a ball in those days, and they did have those dances. These things would go on until 3 hours in the morning, until the next morning. Yeah. Oh, believe me, it's not as hard as you think. They were doing waltzes. Now, one of the things that I have on, this would be for the ball. They wore a flat shoe. They're very similar to this. Sometimes they even, if you see them in museums, they may even resemble a ballet shoe, decorated. They were flat, and it just because the dances actually come with the skirt. If it was
Yeah.
Well, and these things had to stay down, okay? And there is a method. Dale knows, because Dale goes to the ball. But, when you dance, it was like this. So my shoulder would never raise up, okay? Because I couldn't go like that. Because this is a little loose. That's the way it was. So and to be a gentleman, he would cover my hand. So that would be protected, yeah. Arm down. Left arm is down, okay?
Yay, Dale!
Dale's gonna have to give lessons.
Huge rooms. These houses, if you look at some of the old homes and take those tours, a lot of the more wealthy in the population had ballrooms, and they're big. I mean, even look at the ones in Williamsburg, in the governor's palace, that's a big room for its day. Their skirts were like this. Okay, so where our, in the 19th century, they were full out. Well, the ladies in that period were flat, but they came out the sides. Those big flowers. Okay, so literally, you would walk sideways do something like this without a problem.
I kill myself getting food.
Well, but that's another interesting piece of clothing because, again, that was a cage. And, they would make them, and you would put it around your waist, and literally was a cage that kind of went out, and the material went over the top of that. Yeah, you do, and you'll see me sometimes if I'm doing this, I'm making a breeze. And you can feel that. Plus, I know I shouldn't do this, gentlemen may not gentlemen, but these black cotton stockings, they're black and white, sometimes striped red, wool, and white. And
Did you have any trouble driving over here?
well, that's squeezing this. I really should have carried it more. It's going to be a lot easier to squish this thing down. But they wore about 10 pounds of clothing, underneath the dresses, because I have on pantaloons, chemise. Over the top of the chemise is my corset. Over the top of that is a corset cover. Okay, over the top of the chemise and the pantaloons is a straight cut slip. That's an underslip, the hoop. Over the top of my hoop is another slip. That's properly dressed. And to be honest with you, in the winter, if you wear the wool socks, it's cold. You're relative warm. And you wear a boot. Wore a boot all like all black and brown. And she wore a boot. You feel about this hot. They're insulated. You can get a little cold. And sometimes I don't see this part. There's not as much even up here in regular work dress as there is below me. Below me I'm toasty, but above me sometimes I need that whole cape to get that out in a hat. You know, these ladies always wear a hat. This would be for a ball or a dance. There's also another set of clothes that they would wear. And they would be not quite as elaborate as this, but it would be of a fancier material. It would be something that you would wear to church or you would wear visiting, possibly to dinner. I mean, there was a whole social etiquette thing in that upper echelons of society. Now, you in the 4 Irish with your wife, you got a work dress, and you may not even have a boot. You know, again, it was really your income dictated very much into the styles coming out of Europe. Very much. Good days. You never know how to say this. I heard it pronounced goodies, good days. It was a very popular ladies' magazine at the time. All the fashion out of Paris. You know, wood engraved place in color. And what you did was, the Civil War was responsible for mass production of clothes. Okay? At the beginning of the war, chances are, I was making generals' uniforms. Okay? The Army. Okay? Most women were making uniforms. That's why I think at the beginning there was such a diversity. But it was actually between, you know, the sewing machine had been invented, and now mass production needed to be done so that they could uniform the Army beforehand. Prior to that, especially ladies' clothes, they just did not mass produce these like factory. There are some ads in the 50s out of town in Scranton on Lackawanna Avenue. There was a store that advertised ready-made clothing, but it was for men. It was for men. But that's because of the sewing machine, and then with the war, they had a lot of business. Because it produced the uniforms, which is something, you know, in Homer's century, you know, it was just not that.
Another thing is in the century, like the women, if she owned the land and she got married, the land don't go to the husband. She retains the property. If she died, it would be in her will that the husband could live on the property as long as he didn't remarry. But if he remarried, he's no longer entitled to her. It's her property. It's not the husband's. And then she says, I'm going to will it to my oldest son or the oldest daughter, but she makes the will out, and she's the one willing her property. That property, when she marries, doesn't leave her family. That property is hers.
Correct me if I'm wrong, Paul, but that's a very similar scenario to what George had with Martha. Martha had the slaves. Martha owned property. He married well. George did marry well.
Right.
Now, are you saying she owned Mount Vernon?
What did you get Mount Vernon?
Yeah, she owned the property. That was in Martha's family, not George's.
I thought he got it from his brother. I thought he got it from his brother.
You know, these gardens down there in Virginia, the natural bridge is also there. Now, this one television is way up, huge amount of land at Jefferson. Unbelievable tract of land.
She was from Well.
But his wife,
she had wealth.
She didn't know when she died. Rather young. That's kind of a sad story.
But Mount Vernon was in his brother's. Yeah.
That's a story people don't always think about either with Mrs. Jefferson.
He owned
There's a lot of commotion after and the whole scandal.
Fish processing plant.
But there are some letters. She was very ill. She couldn't speak. You know, she's just winded. She was sick. But there are letters they wrote to each other. She's on her deathbed. That I don't think for you guys so much, well, for any of the ladies, they bring you to tears. You know, when you read how close. And again, this is another guy who was never home. Okay? He was never home. I mean, they felt they had a duty, and they fulfilled that. you know, that idea of civics and giving back. Washington, Jefferson, you know, Franklin, one of 22 kids. I mean, these guys were just, you know, I think I'd like to resurrect a few myself today. Because they had that sense of giving back, you know, and for the common good. And that's the whole enlightenment. I think some areas of the world just haven't even reached their enlightenment yet. We were fortunate enough, you know, 200 years ago to have that, and they were well-educated men. And many of them self-educated. They read Cicero, they read, studied Greek, Roman, studied all of this. And it was they all just came together. It's not like they all knew each other before this. Some did, some didn't. John Adams, I don't think gets a lot of credit. John Adams was brilliant.
Oh, yeah.
You know, he's on the cranky side. But if you read some of his stuff too, he's dry. He's dry in his humor. He's a funny guy. And Jefferson and Adams, to me anyway, that was the perfect compliment. You know, together, you know, what one lacked, the other one had, and vice versa. And that's always the story that gives me the chills, because they died. Hours, within hours of each other, and they each thought the other was still alive.
Yeah.
You know, and that's the idea. I get the goosebumps. And they could speak for years too. They really got yeah. But you know, Adams was, he was that Puritan New England. You know, that's the way he was raised. And he had that Anglican Southern, you know, and Jefferson, which is really the tale of the two parts of the country. So I can go on and on, guys. So I don't want to keep you on. You know, thank you for
Thank you, dear. What do you think there? Pretty good program?
Yes, I enjoyed every minute.